Taylor Mathis could not breathe at birth. He was born 3 months premature. Taylor depended on a ventilator to keep him breathing and a heart monitor to check his vital signs. It's not unusual for premature babies. But Taylor's situation was particularly precarious. Taylor was born in Flint, Michigan in 2016. His mother had bathed in Flint's contaminated water throughout her pregnancy. She contracted listeria. Doctors tested Taylor and detected a high level of lead in his bloodstream. Children are especially vulnerable to lead. It attacks their nervous system and their brain. It's a heartbreaking story, but one of thousands arising from the water crisis in Flint. And these stories move from breathtaking, heartbreaking, to disturbing and infuriating as the decisions and leadership failures were chronicled. The political choice to prioritize budget cuts over citizens' health returns as a theme throughout the events, triggering the water contamination in Flint. In 2011, an audit conducted by the state of Michigan's Department of Treasury projected a $25 million budget deficit, inciting the state of Michigan to place Flint's finances under the control of an emergency manager answering directly to the governor. The emergency manager's mandate was to cut the budget at any cost. Flint's water supply alone accounted for $9 million of that deficit. Officials had been using some of that money to cover other shortfalls in the general fund. In 2014, Detroit switched from water that had been supplied from Lake Huron to drawing water from the Flint River. Andrew Dillon, then state treasurer, applauded the decision, saying it would bring desperately needed savings. Government officials intended this move as a stopgap measure till a permanent pipe could be developed. But the Flint River running through town, all the locals knew. The filth and the waste polluted it. They could smell it. Almost immediately after the changeover occurred, residents noticed a murky color in their water, an odor in their water, and they complained to city officials who assured them that the water was safe to drink. Soon after the city detected bacteria and other disease-causing organisms, they put chlorine in the water as a fix. A few months later, they found that the chlorine mixed with the organic materials created a buildup of a cancer-causing byproduct. A study conducted by the Hurley Medical Center revealed that the number of children with elevated lead levels had nearly doubled in the city of Flint. The Water Quality Board stated in a media interview, anyone who is concerned about lead in the drinking water can relax. Flint is fine. In October, the General Motors plant refused to use the water from the Flint River because it was rusting car parts. So the city made arrangements for General Motors to get a different water line and a different source of water. But the Flint residents continued to drink that water. In December, the city of Flint declared a health emergency. 1 month later, the governor's office issued a statement declaring a state of emergency. Later in January, the state attorney general opened an investigation to uncover whether any Michigan laws had been broken. When details of the inquiry surfaced, the story made national headlines, and the nation demanded answers. Given the choices that were made and the stakes involved, everyone felt anxious to hold someone liable. As of August of 2016, the Attorney General for Michigan charged state and local officials. Closing out the year, the AG had charged 2 other plant officials with felonies. One group of leaders that has thus far escaped both criticism and charging were the lawyers who were involved throughout the process. Why should we think about lawyers and their responsibility when it seems to be a matter of failing government? Ask yourself, where were the lawyers who worked for the water companies paid to advise Flint officials on whether the water was safe to drink? Where were the lawyers in the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality who allowed their department spokesman to assure the general public there was no reason for concern over the Flint River water? Where were the lawyers in the city attorney's office who failed to help local officials make the case to state officials once health professionals began to detect contamination problems? Sitting atop the crisis was Governor Rick Snyder, a lawyer. Governor Snyder did in the end acknowledge that he ultimately was responsible, but only after he had blamed career politicians and bureaucrats for the water crisis. He never acknowledged that those very same career bureaucrats served in his administration and executed what they thought were his priorities. The governor, as leader of an administration, sets the tone and the priorities that will guide the choices of state employees. The tone that the governor set at a minimum, enable the state officials to perceive fiscal controls as the most pressing problem. Why bother in asking, where were the lawyers? Certainly, where individual officials broke the law, lawyers had a role to play advising their clients not to take certain steps. But lawyers in both public and private sectors also have leadership obligations that they fail to exercise, to step up, to raise critical questions. Lawyers recognizing and embracing a leadership role might have asked, what are the risks involved in the options we're considering? What do the financial choices say about who we are as a state? And what are the competing stakes in this decision? If lawyers had seen themselves as part of the larger ecosystem, situated to see conflicting vantage points and interests, as an engaged leader would, these events likely would not have occurred. This is not a question of professional ethics or a violation of professional responsibility. This is a question of leadership. Lawyers were intimately aware of the events and decisions that led to the crisis endangering countless lives. That awareness triggered a leadership responsibility. So lawyers need to go beyond the question of, can we do this? And they had the responsibility to ask, should we do this? Flint offers one recent example of a catastrophic event where lawyers played a role. But if we were to examine major events or key decisions made in the industry or in the world, we'd likely find lawyers involved. Lawyers are often positioned to make or advise others of the many critical decisions in today's world. Given the reality, their ability to lead effectively in those positions matters. The world has become infinitely more complex, dangerous, and connected. When I look at the one profession from which we draw our political, business, and organizational leaders, it's the legal profession. We find a deep chasm between what law schools teach lawyers to do and what the world expects of these lawyers. Lawyers become leaders. Legal education ignores leadership as a subject of study and as an inevitability and responsibility for many law school graduates. The legal profession is sending the next generation of likely leaders into a dynamic world, dangerously unprepared. My name's Tony Thompson, and I'm a law professor here at NYU. I've been on this faculty for almost 25 years. And the truth is, we are often in positions of power. We are heads of companies, we are legislators, we are presidents, we are heads of nonprofits. But we are rarely trained for the leadership job. Everything in law school actually militates against it. We look back and not forward. It seems designed only to make incremental change and to get you to shine as an individual. These are often things that help you as an individual contributor, but rarely help you to think about leadership. I wrote this book, Dangerous Leaders, because I look around and I see that failure to teach leadership has led to real dangers. I've spent the last 20 years involved in executive education, coaching Fortune 100 company leaders, government officials, and nonprofit presidents. I believe that lawyers need to start behaving as leaders long before they reach a position with a title. What does that mean? The framework that I write about is called intersectional leadership. Lawyers sit at the nexus between networks, perspectives, and competing interests. From that intersection, lawyers can and should lead not from the top down, but from alongside. Intersectional leadership has 5 key components. The first is to develop a team with traits dissimilar to the leader. Lawyers tend to like to appoint leaders who remind them of themselves, but embracing true definitions of diversity within the leadership team is critical. For law students, what it means is surrounding yourself not only with friends, but with those who have differing points of view, not with the goal of persuading them to your way of thinking, but to engage them in rigorous and respectful discussion and debate. Just because you listen to people with differing positions doesn't mean you put your core values into question. If you talk to people who don't believe in diversity, it doesn't mean that one of your core principles isn't and can't be diversity and inclusion. What it means is that we can continue to hold diversity and inclusion as a key value. We just need to understand others' thinking. It means not only having social media contacts that agree with you, but it means having people that disagree with you and interacting with them and learning their position. The second component of intersectional leadership is to seek out perspectives from unlikely sources. When I speak to global companies, nonprofits, or government leaders, I often ask them to talk to their newest employees, talk to people who have not been acclimatized by the culture yet, and ask them what they see. For law students, it means developing and keeping a set of friends who are not lawyers. We as lawyers become very insular as we continue to maintain relationships with people that think differently and act differently than we do. It's very important. And it also means you should have a point of view. When you take your summer internship, when you become a new associate, you should be able to articulate a point of view, and that starts here. It means raising your hand in class. It means putting your ideas out in the public domain and having to listen to other perspectives and defend those positions. None of us likes to raise our hand. But it is important. And it's also a key when you go into a summer job to ask, why do we do it that way? And if the answer is because we've always done it that way, you should be suspect. The third component of intersectional leadership is to engage in genuine collaboration. Leaders often talk about collaboration, and in law school, what we call collaboration is often teaming. We're working together on a project with the same supervision, with the same support to get the same grade. Collaboration hurts. It's not teaming. You give up recognition, you give up resources, and you often give up revenue for the greater good. Collaboration means that you think differently about your own recognition in a project where you work together with other interests. For law students, it means understanding that you may not get credit or recognition for the effort that you put in on a team project. Not getting that short-term credit doesn't signal that you aren't a leader. The fourth component of intersectional leadership is that leaders should be suspicious of agreement. Many leaders I come into contact with in a consulting capacity often act like they want to hear differing views, but as soon as you challenge their perspective, they defend it tooth and nail. One of the leaders that I write about in the book, and somebody who I've come to know, is this recently retired CEO of American Express, Ken Chenault. He was one of the greatest business leaders of his generation. He talks about embracing the other side. He was a Harvard Law School graduate, and when he began to run American Express, what he began to do was he would argue the other side's position as if it were his own. And what I always tell leaders, and what I will tell you as law students, is that you don't want to have the best argument against your position heard for the first time outside. You want that argument within your team and to be able to defend it. It also means for law students that you take the responsibility not to shortchange, caricature, or belittle opposing arguments, but you embrace them and you understand them, so that whether you're talking about law, business, or politics, that you should be able to question assumptions that come into the decision-making process. The fifth and final component of intersectional leadership is that leaders must act with moral courage, even behind closed doors. Much of what lawyers do happens behind closed doors, and that you need to put checks and balances into place to make sure your personal ambition is kept in check and understands its current role as a leader. For law students, it means having some degree of emotional intelligence, recognizing your ambition, but understanding what the greater good is. So when the law school asked me to do this today, I thought, what better way to talk about leadership than talk with the two of the best leaders that I know? And I'll get to them in a minute. But before I do, I would be remiss if I didn't introduce to you someone who has been a dear friend of mine and one of the state's most important leaders, the Secretary of State for New York State, Rosanna Rosado. Rosanna was a leader long before she became Secretary of State. She was the CEO of El Diario, one of the largest and one of the most important Latino publications in America. She had run that newspaper. She has been an award-winning journalist, but for me, she's just been a great friend and a wonderful leader. Let me introduce, and not a lawyer. Let me introduce my panelists who are lawyers. Nick Turner is a Yale Law School graduate, and Nick had a very conventional resume for a long time. He was an associate at Paul Weiss, a rock star there. He clerked for Judge Jack Weinstein, who was one of my heroes, and he became, after that time at Paul Weiss, a managing director at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he was a member of the foundation's senior leadership team. He's currently the executive director of the Vera Institute of Justice, probably the most important policy-making justice nonprofit in America. And he is continually challenging, conforming notions of what social justice should look like. And if you don't know much about Vera, I urge you to go and spend some time on Vera's website. To Nick's left is somebody many of you probably know, Professor Kim Taylor-Thompson. And what many of you may know is that in addition to being a superstar law professor at NYU, Kim used to run the Public Defender Service of Washington, D.C., what is largely recognized as one of the best public defender offices in America. What most of you probably don't know is that many years ago, Kim was the global chief executive officer of Duke Corporate Education, a global corporate executive education program in the country. I hear by that gasp that is an unknown fact. She is one of the, she was and continues to be one of the most important global leaders in executive education today. What I thought we'd do today is that rather than just drone on me on this microphone, is that we'd have a conversation about leadership. And you get a chance from two excellent leaders to hear how their experiences in law both helped and at times I suspect hindered their ability to lead. I'd ask to start with a brief conversation about their experiences, or a brief comment about their experiences with leadership, and then we'll start a conversation. Nick, I'd like to start with you.
Well, Tony, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this discussion. My experience of leadership, I mean, let me just say a little bit about the organization that I work for, just to help you all get a frame from that obviously influences everything that I have to say. So I run a nonprofit organization, and I think leadership in nonprofits has, tends to have different characteristics than it might in other settings. It's an organization that is committed to transforming the justice systems that exist in America. So it's not just criminal justice, but it's immigration as well, and figuring out how to provide a greater quantum of fairness and equal justice and mercy and commitment to human dignity in all of those systems in a way that line up with the values that we have in society, that we claim to espouse in society, and that we want to actually see activated. And I guess the first thing that I'll say is that I'm humbled to be up here. I'm tickled at the idea of being on a panel about dangerous leaders, because I feel like I'm actually a pretty safe person. I'm not particularly radical. I'm not particularly provocative. And I guess the first thing that I would say about my own experience of leadership is that it is a continuing education, and that I've learned most about being a leader. And let me back up and say that one of the things that I agree with Tony about is that law school, where I went, even though Yale Law School is a place where I think 75% of the people who end up going there are anticipating being leaders in one way or another, or have images of themselves as being leaders, but there's no formal curriculum at all, and no way of sort of understanding even what leadership meant. And so I've spent a great deal of my time learning about leadership by simply by osmosis, by watching other people, and by trying to be a student of leadership from different perspectives. By reading Tony's book and looking at the 5 traits of intersectional leadership and saying, "Oh shit, I don't know that I even have 4 of those things. I need to raise my game." But I think that that in a way what it suggests is that even in this role that I've had of running a fairly substantial and well-established nonprofit, that one of the most important things of leadership, and I think Tony speaks to it, one of the characteristics is getting information from not just the diversity of the team that you have that you're working with, but from a variety of sources. You spoke to it just a moment ago about new employees and what they see and how they view the place that you work. And so I would say that one of my experiences has been, whether I've been successful or not, I don't entirely know, is to try to be a sponge in every environment, and to listen and learn and be open to a range of perceptions and feedback that hopefully helps position me to be a better leader. And the hard thing about that is that I think what we're taught conventionally about leadership is that we have to be hero visionaries. And that what leadership really means is you've got an idea of where you're going, and that's clear, and you have communicated it clearly and somehow mobilized everyone around you to move to that, to move to whatever that North Star direction is. And I find it infinitely more complex and actually infinitely less heroic than that. And that's kind of my story about leadership.
Kim?
Okay, so as I was thinking about what I would say to start this, I started thinking about the examples of leadership that we see on the national stage, and I don't know about you, but those are examples that make me pause, make me gasp sometimes, and at least more often than not make me ashamed that our country is being led so irresponsibly. And so looking at that, you might be tempted to think that the bar is pretty low for being at least a better leader than what we're seeing. And I think that we shouldn't set our sights so low, but in fact, we have a responsibility as lawyers to do much more than that. I believe that as lawyer leaders, we have an obligation to elevate the conversation, not denigrate individuals. I think that as lawyers and leaders, we have an obligation to unite as opposed to finding ways to seed disagreement and to create more division. And I think that we do have an obligation to find ways to inspire us to get to our better selves. And I think that lawyers are uniquely able to do some of these things, but we are not trained to do it. And so both Nick and I went to Yale Law School at very different times. He is much younger. But even back then, they didn't have any training on how to become a leader. And so in my position at the Public Defender Service in DC, the way that I became the director of that office was that I won trials. I won trials in the trial division, and so that got me elevated to a supervisory position, which got me elevated to a training director position, which got me elevated to the director position. I knew nothing about how to navigate the political context of DC government. I was running a governmental agency and knew nothing about the politics of that. I'd never been trained about it, and so I had to learn a lot, like Nick is talking about, by osmosis. And unlike Nick, I was probably pretty radical at the time and loved that, but I had to find a way to modulate my voice a bit and figure out how it is that I could reach across boundaries that I had never had to reach across before to get some things done for the client base that I was trying to represent. My upbringing as a trial lawyer was to go in and cross-examine someone into the ground and to yell and scream and to insist on my way, and that really wasn't palatable as a leader of an organization, so I had to learn some different skills. And I had to learn even more skills when I was a CEO for a for-profit organization, a global organization that provided executive education to Fortune 100 companies and Global 100 companies, because again, I had not been prepared for that. So one of the things that we want to talk about today, and I hope we'll get the chance, is to really think about what it is that law school allows you to do and perhaps you need to do to insist that you learn some skills around leadership. Because even though we're going to be talking about leadership from positions of authority, Nick is running a really important policy organization, a foundation that is critical today. I ran a governmental agency and a company. You don't have to have the title or a position to exercise leadership. And what I find particularly compelling about Tony's insistence that you need to be an intersectional leader is that from whatever position you are, you sit at an intersection between various interests, various stakeholders, various perspectives, and from that position, you can lead even as a law student, even as a young lawyer, even before you get to the position.
So it was completely and wholly by accident, I find myself seated next to two Yale Law School graduates.
Congratulations.
But that said, I want to underscore 2 points that Kim made and use that as a springboard to ask them a couple of questions. First, what I found as a lawyer who went in to lead various organizations after law school was that what we learn in law school is to become technically precise and expert in an area, that we drill very deep in a very narrow area and we become the technical expert. What I found pretty quickly was that what got you here won't get you there as far as leadership, that you need to think about other skills. But to underscore something that Kim just said, I also believe that leadership skills function very similarly to cross-examination or direct examination skills or doctrinal analysis, that if you begin to exercise those skills now while you're in law school, when the organizations that you're a part of, whether it's a law firm, a prosecutor's office, a public defender's office, or another nonprofit or for-profit organization, that folks will see that you have these attributes of a leader. They've seen you exercise those in meetings, and you will be tapped to lead. So I really want to emphasize the need for you to begin to think about leadership now, not to wait until you have some title or some formal authority. Often organizations that I have been involved with have been led from the middle or led in some respects through change from the bottom. So your ability to come in and lead and to hit the ground running requires you to think about this before you get there. But one of the places where the rubber hits the road is when you first face challenges. And I guess what I want to ask both of you is, as leaders, what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced that you recognize maybe for the first time that my legal training might not have been the best foothold or springboard to handle those challenges?
Well, so let me just say that, so to provide a little bit of context that I'm not sure that everyone in this room has. So the business of justice reform in this country, we are at a point that I often describe to people as being ahistoric. And what I mean by that is that there is almost nothing in the experience that those of us who have been engaged in trying to change the justice system for decades or years in the past, there's nothing in that past that tells us a whole lot about what we need to be doing in the future. And the reason for that is that what has been an area of what I often describe as malign neglect, that the public really didn't care about these systems. It didn't care that there were more than 2 million people incarcerated or 15 million arrests or stop and frisk and all of these kinds of things that characterize the system. We're now at a place where there's a mobilization and an energy for change and a set of ambitions and an energy that never existed before. So it's an entirely different kind of reality, where politicians are actually fighting over who can be a bigger reformer, where you turn around and you either bump into Meek Mill or you bump into Kim Kardashian, and they're both talking about justice reform, but that never would have happened before.
And I've never bumped into Kim Kardashian.
Give it time. So I set that out as context because the world in which I'm working and in which I inherited ownership of the Vera, of leadership of the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a 58-year-old organization that has a set of habits and conventions and ways of understanding itself and within the ecosystem and ways of doing its work for the 53 years before I started, now need to be questioned and reversed and maybe exploded in some, in some regard, and that it requires trying to imagine and be ambitious about a future that for the organization that simply wasn't possible for my predecessors. And so the biggest challenge has been, at a sort of existential level, was to think without any sort of trails blazed for us, or for me, how to move in a direction of change that could be interpreted as being violent or disparaging of the past of the organization. And it's not enough to, paint some pretty picture of what the future is and to try to inspire people, but you have to move an entire organization. And by an entire organization, I mean the human beings who work there, to either try to convert them to a new way of thinking and a new openness about how to be ambitious about their work, or the stakeholders outside of the organization, whether they are funders or competitors or the clients that we work with, who are prosecutors and police whose systems we're trying to reform. And so I would say that existentially the hardest thing has been how to have that vision thing and also realize that that one of the dangerous things a leader can do is outrun their supply lines. And if my people, both inside and outside the organization, are not with me, and they're not going to be just with me because I can mount a good argument, I have to tap into their incentive structure. I have to figure out how they become part of the change in the organization. If funders and others who we count on to put the fuel in our tank to make our little car go disagree with the direction, or we haven't done a good job of helping them understand why the place has to change, then it would be threatening to the institution. So I think that the complexity of that is what is just a huge challenge. That you can't do it alone, that there's a chorus of people who you need to bring with you, who are watching and must participate. They have to be owners of the change. I am happiest when I see people on my staff who actually lead in very small ways that they don't even recognize as leadership. They question a way of having done things, and that opens up challenge for convention. But that's the world that I live in, where I think that is the persistent challenge.
Kim.
So there were lots of challenges that I faced as a young leader of the Public Defender Service. Let me identify two and leave it at that. One of the things about an office of 75 lawyers and 75 staff who are part of a public defender office is that the core of who they are is really around fighting authority at every possible point. You hire people who are really willing to come in and say to the government, you cannot do that. If you expect to do that, you've got to get through me. So they are fighters, they're irreverent, they have no respect for authority. This was the group that I was running, okay? I was leading this group. And so one of the things that you had to figure out was, how do I kind of corral this group, but not help them, or not control them? Because what makes them wonderful and able to represent clients is that spirit, that ability to fight everything, to resist rules, to actually say, I don't care what you say, I'm going to fight it this way. So I had to leave room for that, but I also needed to manage an agency. So figuring out how to navigate that was really quite difficult for me, but I think I had a number of trials and errors around that, but I think that I had to learn that, so that was a challenge. The second challenge was, I mentioned being the head of a DC agency. Being in DC is unique in many ways, in part because you are funded by the DC government and you're answerable to the federal government. So to get a budget, I had to go through the DC City Council and had to go to Congress. And so understanding that political dynamic was really quite strange and eye-opening. But when I came into the position as director, DC had never experienced a budget deficit in its history. And so, of course, I come in and I'm expecting to be able to ask for more money, just like every one of my predecessors had. And I get a message from the mayor saying, you need to submit a budget request that's 10% less than what you had last year. And so I was like, well, wait a minute, you can't do this. This is my first time being here. I should be able to get what I want. And that wasn't what I got. It was 10% less. And so initially I started thinking that what I needed to do was to figure out, okay, how do I manage in an environment where I have a 10% less budget? And I talked to some people who were part of the public defender service who had political experience. And one was, and this is going to those unexpected resources, this was somebody who was a social worker in my office who was unbelievably politically astute. And he said to me, Kim, if you accept that you can do business at 10% less, they're going to come to you next year and say, okay, you did it last year, then you can do 15% less next year. So you've got to push back. So I said, okay, it's my first time, but okay. So I asked for more. Rather than sort of asking, to have the same budget as the last year, I said, I need 10% more. It's just, I was just being crazy, but I said, I'm just going to ask for it. What can they do? Just tell me no, I'm going to ask for it. And then I lobbied. I got people to work with me, my board members. I got advice from other people outside of the public defender service on how to approach the various council people and to approach Congress. And what ended up happening was that we got what we asked for. And then I didn't know what to do with all that I had asked for because I had never expected to get all that we asked for. But the point was that in pulling from different sources and dealing with a challenge that I had never seen, I realized that nothing that I had seen had prepared me for it. So I need to ask lots of people who perhaps had more political experience. Unexpected resources came up and helped me figure my way so that we actually could push for something that was unimaginable at that time and actually get it.
So anyone who knows Kim should not be surprised that she asked for 10% more when she was supposed to ask for 10% less and expected it. But
spoken by my husband over there.
I want to push on that a little bit.
Only 10%?
Thank you, Nick. Thank you.
I want to push on that a little bit, and that is that they both gave a kind of quick answer when I talked about leadership models, and they said, oh, we learned by osmosis. But Kim, in your response there, you actually drilled a little bit deeper and talked about using other office resources. When you think about kind of the leadership lessons, how'd you learn those lessons? When I look back at my leadership lessons, and this is a result of being legally trained, too many of our errors come at the cost to clients. And we learn kind of on the backs of clients as lawyers. What I learned pretty quickly was that I worked as a public defender in the community I grew up in, and so I often knew or went to high school with people I represented as a public defender, and was allergic to the notion that I'm going to learn while I'm doing these cases for the first time. So I looked, as you just described, to other resources both inside and outside the office for help. As you move from the operational aspects of the work and you think more of how you've both developed as leaders, and both of you in all of your leadership capacities have been incredibly inspirational leaders, but also hands-off, letting other people get the spotlight leaders. How'd you learn those lessons? Nick, how'd you learn kind of not to have to be in the spotlight all the time and not to have to be, as you described it, I think quite accurately, the heroic inspirational leader?
Well, I've gone through much of my life not really knowing what I want to be, but knowing what I don't want to be. And I'd be like, I don't want to be like that jerk who's like super self-congratulatory, narcissistic, always trying to get the spotlight. So on some level, like even as a kid, when I looked at peers, I was like, well, that's definitely not the human being that I want to be. So there's that. That's not a very serious answer. The more serious answer to it is that in some respects, looking back, I created my own life curriculum. So what I mean by that, again, I've taught nothing about this in law school, but I always had a desire to lead an organization at some point, and thought that I had something in me. I don't know that I could have named it that would make me decent at it. But when I went to the Rockefeller Foundation after having spent some time at Vera, I went not because I was interested in philanthropy and not because I was interested in the work that I was going to do, because I actually didn't know what the work was that I was going to do. There had been a leadership transformation there where the new president had come in and was essentially trying to fundamentally, create Philanthropy 2.0. She took over a legacy organization that she thought was stale, and she thought that it needed to be playing a very different kind of game. And so it was this Rockefeller is the oldest philanthropy in the country. So here's this woman who's fantastically bright and forceful. Her name is Judith Rodin, and she was the first president of Ivy League college, first woman president of Ivy League college. So it was this immovable object meeting this incredibly forceful individual. And I basically went because I was like, that's going to be fun. Like, that will be a really interesting thing to see how that leadership trick plays and how that management trick plays. And so I use that as an example because I wanted to be a student and to be a participant and to watch that. And the other ways that I created curriculum were that I got myself on a few boards so that I could look at leadership from a different point of view. So I could experience being part of a leadership team that was being run by a very forceful, clear person of what she wanted to do and see how that interacted with an organization, and then have a very different perspective with others. And then occasionally I read. But I will tell you that the teachers who taught me most are two four-legged creatures named Pablo and Buttercup. They're my dogs. And the reason that they taught me something, so one of the things when I started to run Vera, I had a similar situation to Kim's. I inherited a deficit. It was not clear that we were going to be able to close that deficit. And if you have a deficit when you're running a nonprofit, that means you do not have any money to invest in new initiatives. You have no dry powder. And so I knew that at some point I was going to have to make structural changes. I was going to have to cut some positions. It was going to be an unhappy situation. And that's a terrible thing to inherit as a leader. And I knew that I could probably raise some money to make that a little less worse, but there was going to be a bit of pain involved. So one of the first things that I thought of was that it was really important for the environment, the work environment, to be one of collegiality and happiness and civility and connection, and that we had to create a foundation for that before bad stuff could happen. I couldn't walk in and do something terrible. We had to build links with people. And the reason that I say that I know that from Buttercup and Pablo, which is that I had recently gotten these two dogs who were puppies, and my experience of in my neighborhood where I lived, I would basically walk from the subway to home. I was very transactional, from the store to home. And then I got these dogs, and I would walk around the neighborhood, and people would stop and talk to me. And they'd say how cute my dogs were, and then I'd get into conversations, and I made friendships. And every morning, by the time I got back in my house to shower and get ready for work, I'd had like 6 or 7 really pleasant interactions. Smiles, good mornings, conversations, things of that nature. And it became really clear to me that that is an essential aspect of what I would describe as institutional life. So I did a little bit of research, and it turns out that there's actually research on happiness and happiness in the workplace and why happiness is really important. And one of the things one of the things that drives happiness, that creates happiness, is, well, there's transparency. There's not micromanaging. The other thing is creating an environment where you can have lots of positive, unexpected, happy collisions between people, essentially that build the ligaments of trust and love and fondness and eventually collaboration. So one of the first things I did is I created, I said, we're going to have monthly breakfasts, and we're going to do these things called randomized coffee trials, where every month you sign up, and then you get randomly paired with some person who you may or may not know, and then you have a 30-minute coffee with them just to get to know them, to talk about whatever. And we did a few other really small, low-cost things like that to try to build a culture of connection. And I wouldn't have known it if not for my dogs.
I like it. So let me ask you both a question. Law school is inherently transactional. They tell our first-year law students, our second-year law students, but primarily first year, if you don't know a professor, go in during office hours. And I remember hearing that as a law student, and do what? What do I talk to a law professor about during office hours if I don't have questions about the course? So one of the things that I had to do and had to be very kind of careful about it was to develop role models and mentors that it wasn't a transactional relationship. I just liked what you do, and it created an odd group of characters that remain my friends to this day, but had nothing to do with what I was interested in politically or professionally. They were just people who I admired, who were nice, who were good teachers, who had other parts of their personality that I aspired to. Kim, let me start with you, but how do you all pick role models or mentors, not only when you were in law school, but to today?
So I think that usually my role models were in the criminal defense arena, because I was so immersed in that I tended to focus on people who were doing the work. So what comes to mind is one person, Charles Ogletree, who was a mentor to both of us, who actually introduced us. And so, yeah, I know.
I still have a bone to pick one up.
No. But he is currently a law professor at Harvard. But what drew me to Charles Ogletree was that he was this client-focused individual who could make every client feel like you are the most important person in the moment and ever. There's nobody else here, I'm just talking to you. And he not only did that with clients, but he did it with their family. He did it with jurors. Jurors thought, oh, he's talking just to me. He was masterful in a courtroom, and he was masterful with people who disagreed with him. They came out walking away saying, I really like that guy. I don't exactly agree with what he said, but I feel good about the interaction. And so largely because of what I saw him do and how he was able to accomplish so much, not only for his clients, but for things that he cared about, I actually just stuck to him and tried to watch what he did, learn from him, and to pick his brain at all times. So while we were public defenders together at PDS, I just would watch him in trial. I would seek him out, ask him questions. When I became director, I would call him. When I chose to become a law professor, I called him, and he's the one who made me advocate for myself to actually get a higher salary than they were asking me to, or offering me. But it was largely because I saw his ability to create a space where he was fully present. He was fully able to listen to what the other person was saying and actively listen to what they were saying and was emotionally engaged with them. I found that to be something that was really important, and it was something that I tried to bring into my leadership as well.
Nick, what about you?
So I guess there are three answers. One is that I'll say that picking mentors is something that I haven't done well. And I think it sort of relates to one of the things that I mentioned earlier, or maybe this is just intrinsic to me, is that there's a challenge in leadership. So we were just talking a moment ago where I was sort of saying, we probably shouldn't buy in too much to this notion of sort of heroic leadership and having your vision and driving it forward. It's easy for me to say, but I sort of live with that every day, where I feel like people expect me to have a vision and answers for everything and to be invulnerable. And so sometimes I really tilt towards that. So sometimes, having mentors means actually having a degree of vulnerability and being able to admit that there are things you don't know and things that you need help with. And that has always been a hard thing for me and remains hard to this day. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that sometimes people just pick you, and so I'm usually really grateful when they do. And if they see something in you that you haven't seen in yourself, it can be an eye-opening experience. I think the third thing that I've done is I'm probably a sort of intuitive and sort of emotionally based person, so I know that part of leadership means having a vision and thinking about not outrunning your supply lines and thinking about how you move your stakeholders and constituents forward. But I'm really attracted to people who I think, and this relates to the moral courage thing, but I'll expand it a little bit more, but who are just good human beings and live goodness, and that you see it in all sorts of, small ways. So I was sold on one leader who I worked for when I had been told in that organization, this organization prioritizes punctuality. I thought, all right, fine, I get it. Yeah, I'll try to be on time to everything. And then one of my first meetings that I went to, for various reasons, my wife was away, I had to bring my kids to school, there was no way that I was going to make it on time for this all-hands meeting. The best I could be, just judging by the MTA, was like 9 minutes late. And sure enough, I was 9 minutes late, and I arrived to the meeting, and a colleague was busy calling down to my office and saying, oh, there you are, whatever, And so that made me very nervous, and I was new to the organization. And then at the end of the meeting, I went up to the leader, and I said, listen, I'm really sorry. I know punctuality is important here. I was told by HR, I'm not making excuses. But Teresa's away, and so on. I told the story, and she just said to me, she said, it's I thought I was gonna get reamed out. And she just said, it's okay. Sometimes you need to have those extra hugs and kisses in the morning with your kids. I mean, it still sort of chokes me up now because what it actually showed was, you're human. I'm a human, I understand. And I was like, okay, I can work for you. Like you get me. And I've seen it in other leaders who they don't have heirs. Darren Walker, who was who I worked for, who now runs the Ford Foundation, and is a fantastic leader, is the most democratic human being I've ever encountered, who has, much to his detriment, time for everyone. And it doesn't matter whether you were the lowliest administrative assistant and you needed career advice. He made time. There's time for people. And that's just goodness. So I pick and choose, and I like when I see things like that, I think, well, that's what I want to bring in my game.
So let me tell you all, I've got 2 more questions for them. You've had a chance to eavesdrop on our conversation, then I'm going to open it up to you. But I've got a kind of good news, bad news, or bad news, good news scenario. As you look forward, both of you have mentioned in passing the significance or poignance of this moment in history where we are as a nation. What do you see as some of the most formidable leadership challenges that we face as a society at this moment in time? Kim?
You go first. No, I'm going first on that one.
This may not come as a surprise. I don't have a good answer for this. I think, look, all of us have been, are students of history, and we look back at certain eras that maybe get reduced to a paragraph in our history textbook, like the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution from 1870 to 1910, whatever. I'm sure the dates are wrong, but you guys get the idea. And we think, so that was a moment in history. But people lived through 40 or 50 years of incredible disruption. And I think we are right in the midst of that now. And I think we'll be in the midst of it for a long time. So the kind of transformations that we're seeing around the globe, what it was digital, and it's AI, and it's and the jobs of the future are going to look incredibly different than they do now, and we're worried about what happens not only to blue collar jobs but white collar jobs, and there's a massive global migration and people feeling displaced and having to live with the feeling of displacement, not just today, but for like the next 3 decades, and then demographic shifts. And I think we're in the midst of something incredibly complex that I think complicates the leadership question, because leadership is probably easier when you're in more of the world's never static, but I just think that it is way more dynamic now than maybe it was 20, 30 years ago. So I think that's a big thing. I think demographic change in this country is another huge challenge. I mean, demography is not destiny, but this country is going to be, majority, minority, call it what you will, majority black, white, black and brown, 2045. And so that means that the complexion of the country and people who are our innovators or our taxpayers, who are going to pay our social security, we're going to depend upon in this country to be the sources of prosperity in our future. I think it's a matter of national security, and I don't think we're doing very well with it right now. I mean, I was very hopeful about it in the Obama years, and now I think we obviously are experiencing the dark underbelly, and because the debate is getting so polarized, it's actually hard to have a really sensible conversation about it. And so leading in that context and thinking about how we're building towards a longer future, and thinking about who the future workforce is going to be and who that future workforce is going to serve in a moment of massive polarization and enmity and us versus them, I think is a remarkable challenge.
Professor Taylor-Thompson.
So, every day when I listen to the radio, or I'm reading online, or I'm hearing statements that are being made at the local level or at the national level, I am reminded that we are at one of those momentous points, and it does feel like it's been going on for a long time, and it probably will extend even longer. But I think we're at a defining point in our democracy where we have to make some decisions to stand up to the kinds of things that we're seeing. When we talk about, appealing to our basest instincts or elevating our conversation and our discourse to something else, I think that's where leadership comes into play. And we're not seeing leadership where we need to see it. When we talk about issues of racial equity and justice, I think that you're hearing people move to the extremes and not talk about how it is that we are better as a country because we have these diverse views and perspectives and thoughts that intertwine and allow us to be the place that we are. And so we have allowed that narrative to be taken apart, and I think that there's a leadership component to bringing it back together and reminding us who we ought to be and who we can be. I think that the leadership challenge is not just at the political level, the national level, or the state level, or the local level, but it's within our classrooms, it's at this level, making sure that we stand up when we see things that shouldn't be happening, that we act with the kind of moral courage that Tony talks about when nobody else is noticing, but we know in our heart of hearts that this is the right thing to do, and calling it when we see something bad that's happening or something that's divisive or denigrating. I think those are the leadership challenges that we face today.
So the good news is there's something about the water at NYU Law School. I have seen in my time here some phenomenal leaders. Today I look at people like Hakeem Jeffries, who very hopefully after a week may be one of the leadership people in the House. Think of people like Damaris Hernandez, who's the first Latinx partner at Cravath, Swain & Moore. I look at Andy Williams, who was in here a little while ago. People like Breon Peace, who's a managing partner at the Cleary Law Firm. We produce leaders from this institution. Quickly, because I want to give plenty of time for questions, and I see Michael standing up there in the back with a microphone, so he's ready. What advice do you have for the young law students in this room who aspire to be leaders in their profession, in their communities, in society? What advice would you give them?
I think you have to be active students. You have to if you're interested in leadership and your institution, even if your institution actually does have a curriculum that includes it, as you go forward in your careers, you have to make sure that you're actively satiating your hunger to learn more about leadership. So that breaks down, I don't know, read an article a month from the Harvard Business Review. I'm making that up, but I'm saying like that. But do some reading just to expand your mind. Look for models of people. Pay attention even to the President of the United States. I mean, ridiculous for me to say, Kim talked about the current president, but I watched President Obama, and I run an organization of 220 people, and one of the things that President Obama taught me as a leader is that I had some responsibility for the emotional well-being of my tiny little flock. And so when terrible things happen, as they did this weekend, that they expected me to say something about it and to try to put it in perspective. And boy, did I hate writing that email. But just pay attention to things around you and try to own it in a very purposeful way. I think you have to be an affirmative, purposeful, active shopper in order to really take in lessons around leadership.
Yeah. I think I would tell law students to demand to be taught some issues around leadership. It's not in your curriculum, and so you ought to be asking for it. Occasionally Professor Thompson teaches a course on leadership, and so I'm not saying that he should teach it, but there should be some.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate that.
But you could read his book. That's a wife doing that. But I also think that it's really about some of the things that he talks about in terms of intersectional leadership. Make sure that the people around you are not an echo chamber. Make sure that you are engaging with people who have different thoughts. That's a critical component of leadership. Make sure that you are checking yourself on your moral compass. We've seen far too many lawyers and leaders lose that sense of a moral purpose. There is one. We know what's right in our heart of hearts. And so listen to that voice. And really find ways to work with other people, learn from other people. We come in with a variety of experiences and perspectives that have shaped us to this point, but they've often sometimes narrowed our thinking. So try to find people that don't look like you, don't have the same experiences, and continue to learn, because that way I think you do become a better leader.
Thank you. Questions from our panel? Michael?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for doing this. In my experience, one of the most difficult situations to be in is finding yourself under leadership, whether that's your direct supervisor or up the chain, who maybe don't follow the advice that you've given today. So what advice would you have for students who find themselves in that position and need to manage up?
So I worked for one of the worst public defenders in the United States for the first few years of my professional career.
Tell us how you really feel about it.
And what I found was, and one of the reasons I write about what I write about, is that I had to lead from behind. I essentially found people who were like-minded. I created an organization, and I worked in the community, even though that office didn't have an experience doing that and didn't value that. So I think what you've got to do is redefine your circles, and they become smaller circles. But I think it's very important that you learn, if not what to do from watching a bad leader, what not to do. So I think that's at least my first response to that.
I mean, one immediate response to this is a little bit more of a long-term thing if you're in an organization, is to encourage the organization to evolve as it properly should. So, and that means to have 360 performance reviews that create a culture that allow for feedback from multiple places. It doesn't solve your particular problem. I agree with what Tony says. The other thing that I would also challenge you or anyone else on is that this will not be the last time you have a terrible manager or leader. And so finding resilience in yourself and figuring out how you can make things optimal and effective in that environment and naming those things, and seeing it as a challenge to develop strategy so that you can be the best you can be is a really important source of strength and capacity going forward.
Hi. I hope this is an appropriate question, but I wanted to ask about leadership in the city. There are dumpster fires for the mayor to put out basically across the city, be it in the 3 or 4 Department of Education scandals that are happening right now. Obviously, the trains, which is in part a sort of juvenile tiff between the mayor and the governor. In relation to Flint, I wanted to ask about the NYCHA lead paint crisis that's currently happening and the lack of heat that a lot of NYCHA residents will have. I struggle particularly with someone like Mayor de Blasio because of the rhetoric he espouses, and he's a Columbia JD graduate, I will say. He went here for undergrad. But it's very difficult to reconcile, the race to the bottom wokeness you were alluding to with someone who's sort of systematically failed to take responsibility for anything happening in his administration. And a lot of New York is a problem of long-term leadership failures. There's not political capital in investing in long-term infrastructural things, and a lot of it is coming to the fore under his administration. But I guess, yeah, one, if you have any thoughts about NYCHA and paint, and then two, also, the deployment of the law department as a means to sidestep any responsibilities, and maybe that's my misunderstanding of the city's legal counsel, but the law department is appealing police misconduct settlements and trying to wiggle out of any culpability for what's going on in NYCHA. So lawyers abound and are constantly disappointing, and Kurt, that's your
I wrote a whole book about that. Let me say two things, right? One is we should not conflate the lawyer's role. So I think of Zach Carter as corporation counsel and his role, his formal role with the city. And so he may have a formal role if he's directed by the mayor, to appeal settlements. That's different in substance and in kind to what I write about with regard to Flint, where the failure there was a failure of leadership to say, even if you're going to make these decisions, these are considerations, leadership considerations, that you must take into account. Do I think the current municipal administration gets that kind of feedback from its lawyers? I don't think so, frankly. I think that lawyers, by and large, don't emerge beyond their prescribed legal role. And I think they aren't encouraged to do it in law school. They aren't encouraged to do it as young law firm associates or young law department members in the city. So I think you have to begin to decide pretty early on what kind of lawyer you're going to be. And it doesn't curry favor with the client when you say, if you set up these incentives, Wells Fargo, you're going to have people who open false accounts or who do things very badly and prey upon your clients, your consumers, your customers. So I think one of the reasons why I like the vantage point of having these conversations in law school is that you guys have a long view to begin to think about what kind of lawyers you want to be. And I think that you can begin to think about leadership in more fundamental ways now to create, to facilitate kind of breaking the log jam of the frustration you've sounded in your question about what's going on at the city level.
I think we're out of time.
I think we have time for one more question. Right over here on the far corner.
Thank you. Hi, I apologize for my gasp earlier.
Didn't know she had been in the private sector, huh?
I wrote up my question just so I don't miss anything. So much of the framework depends on the diversity at the boardroom, so to speak, or the decision-making process. And we know that competitive law schools are notoriously lacking in diversity, and these paths to being leaders in the law, like private practice and clerking, are also lacking diversity. For instance, I think a 2012 Yale Law School study on Asian Americans in the law noted that about 82% of federal judicial clerks are white. I was wondering if your discussion in the book touches on the obstacles to diversifying these leadership positions, as well as the paths to leadership in the law.
It does. I mean, I think that one of the things that I talk about is how we get current leadership to evolve in both its thinking. We I don't know that Nick is old enough to be in this cohort, but we come from a period of time in our society where command and control structure was the predominant form of leadership, where people believed our leader has to be all-knowing and all-powerful. And even the philosophies of transactional leadership and transformational leadership require to a certain extent that there be an all-powerful single leader that either incentivizes or inspires those who are his followers or her followers to take certain actions. We're in a different time now. We're in a more complex, more interconnected, and more diverse time. And so to get leaders to say, in order to succeed, even under conventional metrics now, the command and control leadership structure simply won't work. That's where we're at. And what that means, we've got to continue to think that way in law school. We've got to continue to think that way in law firms. Getting judges to think that way is a different animal a little bit. But I think that your point's well taken, that I think it's not, we can't wait for the change. When Nick says, for you to think about leadership, you have to think about it now and be active now, that's really the point of the book. So I think it does touch on those.
And I think in a business context, so wearing the hat that made you gasp, one of the things that happens with large companies, Fortune 100 and Global 100 companies, is that there's a business case to be made for diverse leadership along gender lines and racial lines because their customer base is diverse. And so if you're trying to anticipate your customer needs and stay ahead of your customer needs, you better have some voices in your leadership that are actually understanding those customers and able to say, this is what we need to do as a company. And so you can make that business case, and there's all sorts of data out there that shows that businesses that have diversity at their leadership level and at their board level are more profitable. Okay, so you can talk to them at the bottom line and say, this makes business sense to do this. And that actually enables them to at least get past, diversity as being a nice thing to do, but diversity is a good thing for business.
Join me in thanking my panel.